happen to be sitting in the same chair because I am the chairman of this panel. The panel is the Scandinavian countries and the Holocaust. And it basically provides the context of Scandinavia within which there will be a discussion in the second panel starting at 2 o'clock of Finland in particular. Our first speaker is Professor Henrik Meinander, who's Professor of History at the University of Helsinki and has been since 2001. He's the author and editor of a number of books, including the anthology The Nordic World, Sport and Society, and the forthcoming translation, The History of Finland. He has been curator of the Mannerheim Museum in Helsinki and director of the Finnish Institute in Stockholm. Professor Meinander is a member of the Finnish Society for Science and Letters and of the Swedish Royal Academy of Science. It is a great boon to this panel and to the conference and to the Wilson Center that Professor Meinander will give the first talk. It will be called Scandinavian Countries on the Sidelines of the Holocaust, and there's a question mark after that title.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for the invitation to this very important seminar. As a Finn, I'm especially glad that we are arranging it here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As many of you know, President Wilson was in a crucial role when the recognition of the Republic of Finland happened during the Versailles Peace Treaty in 1990. Mr. Chairman already mentioned the topic of my lecture, so I just start without any further words. In 1945, the Jewish historian and philosopher Hannah Arendt predicted that the problem of evil will be the fundamental question of post-war intellectual life in Europe. Her prediction came true, but with a delay of at least 3 decades. It was only when the Cold War began to lose its ideological charge that scholars and the larger audience in Europe began to discuss the problem of evil more freely and more honestly in public. And when this happened, the Holocaust would, for understandable reasons, become the case around which much of this discussion would circle. However, the discourse about the Holocaust has had its own profile in each country and region of Europe, much depending on how strongly it was involved in the Second World War, how much it was dominated by Hitler's Germany, and how large its Jewish population was. I will, in the following, outline the development in Scandinavia during the Second World War and discuss how it influenced the so-called Jewish question in the region. Firstly, I look shortly at the domestic driving forces. My Scandinavian colleagues will go into more depths in this matter, but in order to understand how the Scandinavians reacted to the pressure from the great powers, some idea of the domestic arena is needed also here. Secondly, I focus on the motives and actions of the main combatants of the war and ask what function and role Scandinavia had in a larger context. And thirdly, and finally, I reflect on the moral responsibility the Scandinavians bear for the Holocaust. When we outline the anatomy of European anti-Semitism, it is crucial to look at where the Jewish population lived and how much it was integrated with the majority population. Anti-Semitism had spread all around Europe in the late 19th century. But it was only in the dense populated regions with a, relatively speaking, large Jewish minorities where the animosity resulted in a more systematic and violent discrimination. Scandinavian countries did not constitute such a region in Europe. They were and are still today among the most sparsely populated nations in Europe. Furthermore, the Jews immigrated much later and in a much less number to Scandinavia than to Central Europe. This resulted in that the Scandinavian Jews were clearly more integrated in the society and majority culture than, for example, Jews in some of the eastern parts of Central Europe. All this is important to consider when we analyze how the Scandinavian majority populations treated their Jewish citizens, how they viewed the brutalization of the German anti-Semitism, and how eager or reluctant they were to rescue Jews from Germany and other parts of the German-occupied Europe. It is indisputable that the Scandinavian countries were outspokenly and categorically against any deportation of their Jewish citizens to the German organized concentration camps during the war. This was a political reality that the German decision makers had to adjust to. On the other side, the bold defense of their own Jewish population did not mean that the Scandinavians showed any special concern for the gradual brutalization of German anti-Semitism, or that they would have been extraordinarily keen to risk their own security or welfare to rescue Central European Jews when reliable information of the systematic terror and murdering against them reached Scandinavia. How shall we understand this phenomenon? Much seems to boil down to the fact that the Scandinavian Jews were understood by their countrymen in the first place as own citizens with exactly the same rights and obligations as other taxpayers and voters in the countries. Scandinavians often emphasize that their national identity has since the early 20th century been built on a strong reliance on the parliamentary democracy. Sometimes this point has been clearly overestimated. But when we analyze how the Scandinavian people coped as societies with the military and political pressure from the two brutal dictatorships in Europe, the key to comprehension is indeed their reliance in a societal order based on a parliamentary democracy. Actually, this reliance in parliamentary democracy had a twofold impact on the development in wartime Scandinavia. On the one hand, it maintained a domestic trust in a national agenda in politics, even in Denmark and Norway, where the parliamentary work was considerably disturbed by the German occupiers. And on the other hand, it sent a clear message to the leaders of the great powers who in their planning of operations and decisions had to take in count that certain actions in Scandinavia would complicate or at least disturb their overall goals in the war. Churchill, Hitler and Stalin were interested in the Scandinavian realm for two main reasons. And neither of them had anything to do with its population or political culture. The first of them was the control over the Swedish iron ore fields in northern Scandinavia. The second was the security of Leningrad. All large military operations and all substantial political deals that concerned Scandinavia were in one or another way intertwined with these two interests. When the Soviet Union in winter 1939-1940 tried to invade Finland, this was first and foremost done to strengthen the defense of Leningrad against the potential attacks from Germany. Truly enough, Soviet Union and Germany had only a few months earlier signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in which Finland, together with the Baltic states, were included in the Soviet security sphere. But this treaty was not signed for eternity, only to win time and positions before their internal confrontation that both parties understood as inevitable and therefore were preparing for. The Baltic states were not ready to fight and gradually lost their independence to the Soviet Union. Finland chose another path. The Soviet demands were not accepted, and after the Red Army had been halted by the Finns in the snowy woods along the eastern border, Stalin decided not to prolong this unsuccessful war, which the Western press was quick to describe as a fight between David and Goliath. In March 1940, the parties signed a peace treaty. Finland lost territories close to Leningrad and had to rent out Hanko Peninsula as a Navy air base. Why did Stalin not complete the invasion of Finland? The main reason for this was not a stubborn defense by the Finns. A clearly stronger motive was the worry that a prolonged war against Finland would complicate the ongoing war on other European fronts. Great Britain and France were in early 1940 preparing for an invasion of the Swedish iron ore fields in order to cut off the Swedish iron ore export to Germany. The German war industry was at that stage of the war still heavily dependent on this crucial import product from Sweden. 40% of the import of this product comes from Sweden, up until summer 1940. As my compatriot Max Jakobsson has proved in his classical study on this theme, for already half a century ago, this situation triggered a number of geopolitical chain reactions in Scandinavia. The Western Allies had covered up their plans of an invasion of the iron fields as a military campaign to support Finland. If this operation would have been fulfilled, Soviet Union could also have been dragged into a war against Great Britain and France. Stalin decided therefore to stop the war against Finland and wait for a more convenient moment for its incorporation. Hitler and his generals also drew their conclusion of the situation. They began swift preparations for an invasion of Norway, which would prevent the Anglo-French offensive and secure the Swedish iron ore deliveries to Germany. And because Denmark was on the road to Norway, the German operation also included an occupation of the Danish territory. The Western Allies tried in vain to convince the Norwegians and the Swedes of the necessity of their operation. The Germans wasted no time for diplomacy and had by the end of spring 1940 got a total military command of Denmark and Norway. Germany had thereby got a strong grip of Scandinavia and its crown jewelry, the Swedish iron ore fields. A Swedish denial of iron ore export to Germany would, under such circumstances, have only one result: a German invasion. The Swedish solution to this threat was a skillful balance policy between two fighting blocs. The Swedish society and industry was throughout the war heavily dependent on import of German energy and paid for this with iron ore and other precious metal products. This arrangement was acceptable also for the Western Allies as long as Sweden was not actively involved in the war. Sweden would continue its trade with Germany up until autumn 1944. But at the same time, it became a haven for political and humanitarian refugees from Scandinavia, Baltic states, and Germany. Let us now return to the Leningrad issue. When Hitler in summer 1940 gave order to begin the preparations for an attack against Soviet Union, he included in his plans a Finnish involvement in this offensive. The foremost reason for this was Finland's strategically decisive position by the Baltic Sea and next to Leningrad and northwestern Russia. Hitler knew that the Finnish options were very few. An alliance with Soviet Union was totally out of question for Finland. France had been invaded, Great Britain fought alone for its existence, the United States had not yet joined the Allied front. A non-allied balance policy as of Swedish model was not either a realistic alternative. Finland stood geographically between two aggressive dictatorships. It would thus anyhow had been dragged into this huge internal contest of the European Lebensraum. In such circumstances, the Finnish leadership decided to jump on the German side, which in winter 1940-1941 seemed to have good chances to crush the Soviet Union. Both President Risto Ryti and Commander-in-Chief Gustav Mannerheim were Anglophiles. But neither of them saw any chance to stay aloof from Operation Barbarossa. But as neither of them saw any chance to stay aloof from Operation Barbarossa, they seemed to have hoped for a renewal of First World War development. First, Germany would force Russia on its knees. Then the Western powers would defeat Germany under American leadership. And even if Germany ended up as a final victor, Finland would in this way gain back its lost territories in Karelia, which certainly would have satisfied most Finns. In spring 1941, strong German forces took offensive positions in northern Finland, Finnish Lapland. Simultaneously, Finland strengthened its military capacity considerably with German support. Finland was thus well prepared to join the German East Offensive in summer 1941. By December the same year, the Finnish offensive had reached eastern Karelia and was, as planned, stopped. This led to a military status quo in Scandinavia and the Baltic region that lasted for almost 2.5 years. The German leadership tried repeatedly to get Finland more actively involved in the war, or at least to sign a political agreement with Germany. Up until summer 1944, Finnish government gave each time a refusal answer. This was due not only to a strong domestic dislike to any further deepening of the links to Nazi Germany. The Finnish efforts to maintain its good relations to the Scandinavian neighbors and diplomatic contacts to the Western allies weighed even more. Great Britain declared Finland war in December 1941. But the parties were never involved in military operations against each other. Even more important was that the United States did not at all declare Finland war, which made it easier for the Americans to defend the Finnish case in negotiations with the Russians and the Britons. The Finnish government claimed thus throughout the war that it fought its own defense war against the Soviet Union. This was a deliberate simplification of the situation. The northern half of Finland was under German control. Finland was even more than Sweden heavily dependent on import of certain goods from the German-controlled Europe. When the Red Army in June 1944 directed a large offensive against the Finnish front, the additional support from the German forces was of decisive importance for the Finns. Nevertheless, at the same time, Hitler was pressed to accept that Finland kept its head in a number of political and military questions. Despite heavy pressure in midsummer 1944 under this Russian huge offensive, it was not its government, the Finnish government, but the President Ryti who personally promised in a letter to Hitler that Finland would not stop fighting the Russians, Russians under his rule. He did so with fingers crossed. 1 month later, Mannerheim took over the presidency and led Finland to a tolerable armistice agreement with the Allies in September 1944. In accordance with this agreement, the Finnish army was immediately turned against the Germans in Lapland. Now, how could the German leadership tolerate this ambivalence in the Finnish commitment? For the same reason as they accepted the Swedish balance policy, which gradually became more frosty towards Germany. As long as the Finnish army held its front line, this supported the German control over the Baltic Sea and connections to northern Scandinavia. Similarly, as long as Sweden continued to deliver first-class iron ore to the German war industry, this spared much energy and manpower for other German war efforts. To maintain this fragile order, Germans were willing to avoid any active involvement in Swedish and Finnish domestic affairs. And as hinted in the beginning, this was also the crucial reason for why not a single Jew of Swedish or Finnish citizenship was deported to the German concentration camps. Even in Denmark and Norway, the German occupation army would often avoid challenging the existing societal order. Over 1,200 Danish and Norwegian Jews were sent to German concentration camps, where almost 800 of them were killed. But to this must be added that almost 8,000 of the Danish and Norwegian Jews escaped to Sweden without any substantial reactions from the German side. The large majority of these refugees, more than 7,000 Jews, fled in this way over from Denmark in autumn 1943. Some scholars have even claimed that this could only have happened because the German occupiers accepted this escape. If this is true, which I am not able to have any opinion about, it reinforces my general thesis that the Germans never gave a high priority to the Jewish question in Scandinavia. For the great powers, Scandinavia was a question about resources and geopolitics, not about demography or ideology. This brings us back to the question of how much responsibility wartime Scandinavians bear for the Holocaust. Could the Scandinavian people and their government have done more to rescue or in some other way stop some of all those millions of Jews who were brutally deported and killed? Sweden rescued in all 12,000 Jews from other countries, which was admirable, but still not a considerable number in this context. Everyone understands that the Scandinavians had not the military capacity to stop the Holocaust. Denmark and Norway were paralyzed by the German occupation. Swedish and especially Finnish military resources had again to be reserved for the defense of their own territories. Attempts to obstruct the Holocaust by boycotting the trade with Germany would not either have been realism. As emphasized, both Swedish and Finnish societies were heavily dependent on import of German resources and goods. The only possibility to rescue more Jews would thus have been to welcome them to Sweden or Finland, which at least in some degree were independent nations. But here again we face cruel facts. Finland fought for its national existence, which required the life of 94,000 Finnish soldiers and massive evacuations of its civil population from Karelia and Lapland. A considerable number of these Finnish refugees fled actually to Sweden. In spring 1945, about 200,000 refugees from different parts of Scandinavia and Europe had arrived to Sweden. Some critics have accused Sweden for having given priority to the Scandinavian refugees and only slowly opening its gates to the Jews from Central Europe. But the question is, why should the Swedish government not have helped its closest neighbors, who also were in great need of help? It would therefore be clearly misleading to claim that the Scandinavians bear a big responsibility for the Holocaust. When the Second World War swept over the globe, all nations did the same thing. They gave priority to their own security and resources. They fought, if necessary, for their national existence and could only, if those conditions were guaranteed, function as true havens for discriminated Europeans, such as the Jews. The only Scandinavian country that somehow filled these requirements was Sweden in 1943 to 1945. But by that moment of the war, Most of the Jews had already been deported or were completely unable to escape to the country. However, ladies and gentlemen, don't misunderstand me. The Holocaust was a European tragedy that will constitute one of the darkest chapters in history of Western civilization forever. As members of its civilization, Scandinavians must also share their relative part of this common responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks for putting into context the not only Finnish, but also Swedish and Danish and Norwegian and general strategic circumstances that we're dealing with here. The next speaker will speak on the fate of the Jews in the other Scandinavian countries, specifically Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. That speaker is Sunni Persson, who holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and is a senior lecturer and associate professor, now retired in the Department of Political Science at the University of Göteborg in Sweden. His book, I'll translate it, The Palestine Conflict, is in its 5th edition. He's an expert in Middle East studies as well. In English, he's published Mediation and Assassination, Count Bernadotte's Mission to Palestine in 1948, and numerous other publications. And his most recent book, which I will not try to pronounce in Swedish, but it's called We Are Going to Sweden. I see a copy of it nearby. We Are Going to Sweden, The White Buses in 1945, was highly acclaimed and quickly sold out in its hardbound edition. It was recently reissued in paperback. It is a privilege to hear from you, Professor Persson. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I quote, 1945, my friend Rena Fried remembers a wagon, a spectre crammed with the barely living skeletons of women. She's one of them. She's 16 years old. By a miracle, she has passed all the selections. By a miracle, she is still alive. This train is taking them to death. The women in the wagons are completely resigned. Suddenly, halt! Someone has stopped the train. The emaciated women know that now the shouts, the beatings, the riding crowds will come, and right afterwards, death. They are helpless and indifferent. Vi åker till Sverige. We are going to Sweden, they say to them in their melodious tongue. Your enslavement is finished. This is a quotation from Miriam Akavia, who is a well-known Israeli author. And that will be my introduction to my speech about the Scandinavian countries and the Holocaust. And I would add to the program that these three states are countries, not counties, as is put in the program. Firstly, Denmark. In 1940, when Denmark was invaded by German troops, Denmark was a very small country. It had a common border with Germany. It had almost no military forces whatsoever, so the order from the government was to the military forces not to fire one bullet against Germans. The Danish government did launch a protest to the Germans, but they continued to administer the country and de facto to collaborate with the Germans. The Germans on their side promised Denmark continued internal self-government, and they never gave the Danish Nazis any real influence over Danish policy. Denmark became the modern country of the German protectorate, showing the benevolence of German occupation to the rest of the world. This fairly idyllic period ended up in 1943. There was a wave of massive strikes all over Denmark. The German Bevollmächtiger des Deutschen Reiches in Denmark, Dr. Werner Best, gave an ultimatum to the Danish government to introduce emergency laws, martial courts, death penalties, etc. The Danish government refused, and it resigned on August 29, 1943. Then the Germans took over also de jure, and they introduced martial laws. The first victims for these martial laws were to become the Danish Jews. Thus, on the 1st and 2nd October 1943, German security police arrested the Danish Jews to send them to Germany. There were protests all over Denmark about this order, but, and this is now known, Dr. Werner Best, the German Bevollmächtiger, played an interesting double game. He had in fact leaked several days in advance this deportation to the Danish underground resistance. He did also leak it to the Swedish legation in Copenhagen, which gave the Danish Jews several days to go underground. And it turned out that there was a massive Danish support for the Danish Jews. The Danes gave shelter to these Jews. It was improvised, an organization to take these Jews over to Sweden across the Öresund Straits. And by this, I think, very famous operation, more than 7,000 Jews were smuggled over to Sweden. We don't know the exact number, how many Danish Jews that were taken to Sweden, because in Sweden the Danish authorities refused to single out the Jews as a single category. As Professor Meinander said, this was the rule all the way through the war, that we did not distinguish between Jews and Aryans. They were Danish citizens plus nothing. Full stop. But there were 481 Jews who were deported. They were caught and they were deported from Denmark. But they were not sent to the concentration camps in Eastern Europe. They were all sent, there is one exception, to Theresienstadt. And as you know, Theresienstadt was not a concentration camp, it was a ghetto, and it was used as the model ghetto from Eichmann and the German propaganda apparatus to show how well they treated the Jews. And this was due to the special arrangements between Denmark as a model protectorate and the German Reich. In fact, there was an interesting meeting in Copenhagen. Eichmann himself came to Copenhagen to investigate this strange result of the deportation of the Danish Jews, and he signed an agreement with Werner Best, where the Germans promised that no Danish Jews would be sent from Theresienstadt onwards to the annihilation camps in Eastern Europe. And the Germans kept this promise all the way through the war. In Theresienstadt, the Danes became the smallest national minority, and they became a very privileged minority. They received food and clothing and such things in Danish Red Cross houses. They were allowed to write letters to their relatives in Denmark, and it was even sent a library from Copenhagen with 1,000 books to the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt. So the amazing fact is that in Theresienstadt, no Danish Jews died from starvation or from brutalities from the SS or other guards. 53 of the Danish Jews did die in Theresienstadt. They died from old age, illnesses, and of course from the immense mental stress, knowing about what was going on, and from angst when they saw the conditions in Theresienstadt. That's about Denmark and the Jews. Can you hear me? Norway. Norway is a very different question. When Norway was invaded in 1940, the Norwegians, who had very feeble military resources, did fight back. And this meant that the Norwegian government and the Norwegian king and crown prince were able to escape to London. So from London, there was a Norwegian government in exile, and they continued the fight against the German Reich. So in Norway, the Germans took over directly and ruled the country, and the first concentration camp was in fact established as early as in June 1940. Another difference was that in Norway there was a strong fascist party, National Samling, which means roughly the National Rally. It was led by Vidkun Quisling, who was a very charismatic leader, a former military and a former Minister of Defense in Norway. The collaborators, who were called Quislings, who became the international name for these collaborators, did very willingly support the Germans, and they also did very willingly help the Germans in their policy against the Jews. However, very early, already in 1940, there was an underground resistance in Norway, and they succeeded in a very discreet collaboration with the Swedish Consulate General in Oslo to smuggle out 925 Norwegian Jews. The border between Norway and Sweden is very long, one of the longest in Europe. And there was a very well-organized network both on the Norwegian side and on the Swedish side, to help refugees from Norway. More than 50,000 Norwegians were in Sweden in 1945. 925 Jews escaped to Sweden. A handful of Norwegian Jews, I don't know how many, remained in Norway during the rest of the war. But in 1942, on the 24th of October, the German security police ordered all Jewish males between 15 and 61 years of age to be arrested under suspicion of activities against the Norwegian state. The following day, all Jewish property was seized by the state in Norway, differing from Denmark. There were protests in Norway, but to no avail. On the 25th of November, all Jewish women and children were arrested. And together with all Jewish men, they were shipped away by boats to Germany. Almost all of them were sent directly to Auschwitz. Most of them were killed instantly. Most of them were taken directly to the gas chambers. And almost all of them died in Auschwitz. A few of them survived. Some of them, I don't know how many, died during the death marches in 1945 from Auschwitz and other camps. And only 21, or maybe 29, Norwegian Jews survived the war from their hell in German camps. Am I short of time? Schweiz. Sweden. In 1939, Sweden, like Norway and Denmark, proclaimed its neutrality. But as you know, and as Professor Meinander told us, Sweden was lucky. We were able to keep outside the war. It was a result of, I think, sheer luck, a very clever diplomacy, and, which is very little known, a dramatic rearmament of the Swedish military forces. That gives Sweden a very special geographic and geopolitical situation in Europe. Together with Switzerland, Sweden was the only country that could make any real humanitarian efforts to help Jews in Northern Europe and in Central Europe. There is a very interesting and highly competent dissertation about Swedish policy in what was called the Jewish question. It's written by an American historian called Paul Levine, and he characterized Sweden's policy against the Jews as from indifference to activism. And the decisive year is 1942. Before 1942, Sweden, like all other European countries, had a very restrictive policy on immigration, and this very effectively hindered many Jews from entering into Sweden, which of course meant that they were doomed to death in their countries. To understand this, again, we have to have the perspective of Henrik here. The overarching goal of Sweden's policy was to stay out of the war. The Jewish question was never crucial in this ambition. For the decision makers in Stockholm, and I point out in Stockholm. I'm from Göteborg on the western side. I think this is an important difference, and we could come into that later on. But if you are sitting in Stockholm, the arch enemy of Sweden and Finland has always been Russia, not Germany. So what the Swedish government in Stockholm was doing was to balance between Stalin's, now it was not only Russia, it was Stalin's communist Russia and Hitler's Nazi Germany. And it was, I think, a very skillful act of balancing. Also, militarily in 1940s, Sweden was quite weak, and the small resources we had, many of them were sent to Finland in their war against the Soviet Union. So, after 1940, Sweden was effectively encircled and besieged by German forces. They were in Denmark, they were in Norway, and in Finland, now we had a pro-German Finnish policy. So during these years, Swedish policy on neutrality had a very clear pro-German tilt. This changed in 1942-43, and that was, of course, basically because of the German defeats at El Alamein in September 1942 and at Stalingrad in March 1943. It was also a result of this rather tremendous military rearmament, and in 1943 the Swedish military forces had become so strong that there could be a sense of self-confidence in Sweden that we might have some capability to face a German invasion. That change also led to a change on what was called the Jewish question. And from then on, we can see a very successive and active Swedish policy to help the European Jews. Important was also all the efforts from the Jewish community in Stockholm especially, and especially from Hillel Storch, who was the representative of the World Jewish Congress, and also for the Jewish Agency of Rescue Committee in Stockholm. And he was extremely active. The turning point was the Norwegian Jews and the deportation of them. In a telegram on the 3rd December 1942, and it was sent by the order of the Swedish Prime Minister, Per Albin Hansson, the Swedish minister in Berlin discreetly told the Germans that Sweden was prepared to accept all remaining Norwegian Jews. This was the first time since 1933, when the Nazi persecution started, that the sovereign state intervened, albeit still informally, on behalf of the Jews. As Jews, not as Norwegians, as Jews, specifically it was stated, and this also included all the stateless Jews in Norway. And as I said before, the smuggling of Norwegian Jews over the border was a very well organized activity also on the Swedish side of it. In 1944-45, and I have seen all the materials in the archives, the saving of the few remaining Norwegian Jews became a high priority in Swedish policy, in the Swedish Foreign Office and for the Swedish Consulate General in Oslo. And it is so that as late as in April 1945, Sweden was able to have the remaining 52 Norwegian Jews transferred from internment in Norway and to Sweden. The next step in this active Swedish policy was concerning the Danish Jews. On the 2nd of October 1943, over the Swedish radio, the Swedish government was prepared to receive all Danish Jews. So this is not any longer discreetly and informally said. It was now announced on Swedish radio. And very many Danes, I guess probably all of the Danes, were listening all the time to the Swedish radio, which was not censored. Lena Jahil, who has written, I think, the standard dissertation about Danish policy on the Jews, considered this to be Sweden's first public statement against Nazi Germany's Jewish policy. And this means that from now on, Sweden is officially confronting the German Reich on the Jewish question, which, as you know, was a very central question for Nazi policy. This announcement was praised all over the world, all over the free world, and I can quote a telegram from New York sent to Prime Minister Hansson on 7th October, praising Sweden, saying, I quote, "This is the first time that the government officially issued a statement announcing readiness to grant asylum to tortured Jews." As has been said before, 7,000 Danish Jews were smuggled over during this. But it should be pointed out that this is not the beginning of the operation. Already before October 1943, the Swedish government and the Swedish legation in Copenhagen had issued various kinds of documents, including Swedish citizenship, to Danish Jews. So more than 200 Danish Jews had received Swedish citizenship before October 1943. And it's also strange to see, and we are back to the German very interesting policy in Denmark, that many of these Jews were allowed by the German authorities to leave Denmark for Sweden. And there are some researchers who believe that the Germans, in fact, the overarching goal for Germans was to get rid of the Jews. If they were smuggled to Sweden, they didn't care. Then, thirdly, we come to the most well-known attempt, the Hungarian Jews in 1944. This is often associated with Raoul Wallenberg, who is, as you know, very well known. I think he became the second honorary citizen of the United States, next to Sir Winston Churchill. I think his importance is a little bit exaggerated. What I have been saying, and I'm quoting the dissertation from Olivan, is that the attempt to save Hungarian Jews is just one more link in this Swedish active policy. And it started before Wallenberg came to Budapest. And there are three central names, almost all of them not known at all, not even in Sweden. Valdemar Langley, he was the representative of Swedish Red Cross in Budapest. Ivan Danielsson, who was the minister, and Per Anger, who was the attaché at the Swedish legation in Budapest. They started months before Wallenberg to save the Hungarian Jews. It seems that it was Langley who invented the so-called Schutzbriefe. He issued documents, a kind of identification document, very similar to normal passports, to give protection to the Hungarian Jews, protection by the Swedish Red Cross. And probably there was a coordination and cooperation between him and the Swedish Red Cross and the Swedish legation in Budapest, although we don't know.
But the legation was also working actively
And on 31st March 1944, the Swedish Foreign Office wired the Swedish minister in Budapest, that is Danielsson, that he might issue Swedish 3-month visas, quote, for all Jews who through us request assistance, unquote. On 15th June, the Swedish legation in Budapest was given total freedom, carte blanche, to issue provisional Swedish passports to Jews. On the 3rd of July, Minister Danielsson had an audience with the Hungarian regent, Miklos Horthy, and he brought the telegram from the Swedish king, Gustav V. And this happens very seldom in Sweden, that we are using the king in these times. The Swedish king appealed to Horthy to, I quote, save those who remain of that unfortunate people, that is the Jewish population. And it seems that this way, and as long as the Hungarians still ruled Hungary, there were no more deportations. Wallenberg arrived not only, he arrived on 9th July, that is several months after these first Swedish attacks. There is no doubt that he was very important. He was very young, he was a businessman, he was very energetic, he was very creative, and he gave, I think, a new impetus to this Swedish resistance. We don't know how many Swedes that were provided Swedish assistance. Levine estimates that at a minimum between 20,000 and 30,000 Hungarian Jews received Swedish protection in one form or another. I checked Yad Vashem database in 2007, and they say that Wallenberg, quote, saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. Some 15,000 Jews were taken into 32 safe houses. Then, finally, the final Swedish humanitarian effort was the famous so-called white buses. The Swedish Red Cross relief expedition to Germany in March and April 1945. This was formerly a Red Cross expedition, and it was led by the vice president of the Swedish Red Cross, Count Folke Bernadotte. But, and that is one of my points in my book, this was not a Red Cross expedition. It was the continued line of Swedish state activities to help Jews and to make humanitarian efforts. It was ordered by the Swedish Department of Defense. It was paid by the Swedish state. It was only military vehicles, and it was career military officers and conscripts who volunteered for this expedition. Count Folke Bernadotte had instruction from the Red Cross to intervene in Germany, preferably directly to Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, on behalf of the Scandinavian prisoners, as Professor Meinander put it. And it was taken for granted that it means also the Norwegian Jews and also the Danish Jews, since they were citizens of these two countries. These instructions, however, were amended on 27th of March by the Foreign Office, so it was also to be included French women, and I quote, to the transfer to Sweden of a number of Jews. Again, we don't know exactly how many that were saved by this expedition, and we don't know how many Jews that were saved. The conditions in Germany during the last weeks were chaotic, and the German bureaucracy broke down, and the Swedes had other things to do than filling in papers. So the figures are very unclear. But my estimate is that this expedition saved more than 4,000 Jews from concentration camps in Germany. All Danish Jews in Theresienstadt were saved. They were transported from Theresienstadt on 15th April, taken directly to Sweden. Norwegian Jews, only 3 were saved, and this was a failure that Bernadotte apologized for very early to the Norwegian government. The last very adventurous expedition was to Ravensbrück. And between 22nd and 25th April, the Swedes, and they were now assisted by Danish personnel and by Danish vehicles under very great difficulties, and now attacks by British aircraft, transported more than 7,000 women out of Ravensbrück. One German source says 7,500. One Swedish source says 8,000 women. Of these, roughly half were Jewish women. Most of these women carried Polish nationality. Many were from France. And there we have exact numbers, 1,615 were stateless Jews. I have written a book about that, and it's called The Åker till Sverige. It came in 2002. It's now in a pocket edition. And just before leaving for this conference, I signed a contract with a German publishing company for a German edition. And we are now negotiating with a British company in London for English translation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.